Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of precision, like, I don't know, like engineering.
Right, yeah.
You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at it and says, there it is.
Exactly.
Broken or not broken, it's fully clean.
Well, it's comforting, right? Because it's binary. We inherently like things to be visible. We want them easily categorized into cause and effect. A broken bone is just a localized failure in a system that's otherwise working fine.
Yeah, exactly. But step into the world of systemic collapse, whether that's, neurodevelopment, trauma, or the complete unraveling of a civilization, and suddenly that x-ray machine is just broken.
Oh, completely. It's useless.
We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky. And I mean, that is exactly the energy we are bringing to today's deep dive.
I love it.
We are looking at a stack of your notes and research, simply titled The Black Death.pdf. But let me just set the record straight right now for you listening. If you think we are just going to read some grim, straightforward medical history of the 14th century today, you are in for a total surprise.
Yeah, that's not what this is.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Our mission is to explore the actual mechanics of collapse. We're looking at how complex human systems respond to, just unimaginable suffocating pressure.
Because, when we casually mention the Black Death, the human brain just struggles to process the math.
It really does.
We are talking about an event that between 1347 and 1351 wiped out anywhere from 30 to 60% of Europe's population.
Wow.
And in some dense urban centers, mortality rates breached 80%.
80%. That's a ghost count.
Exactly. But the pathogen itself, the bacterium Yersinia pestis, is only half the story.
Right.
The other half, and frankly, the far more complex half, is the social, economic, and psychological machinery of the world that the disease invaded.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Because the way history is usually taught is very much that clean, X-ray narrative I mentioned.
The textbook version.
Right. It's taught as if Europe was just sitting there, having a grand old time in the Middle Ages, going to jousting tournaments.
Island cathedrals, yeah.
Exactly. And then suddenly, boom, the plague drops out of the sky like a rogue meteor and destroys a perfectly robust, functioning world.
Which is such a massive misconception. The sudden apocalypse narrative just completely ignores the structural reality of the time.
So what does the data actually say?
Well, the documents you shared, they reveal this fascinating paradox that totally rewrites that assumption. The Black Death was absolutely a sudden shock.
Yeah.
But it did not hit a pristine, healthy civilization.
It hit something else entirely.
Right. It hit a system that was already profoundly fatigued. It was buckling under its own weight.
So the cracks were already there.
Exactly. It exploited vulnerabilities in the societal foundation that had been compounding for over a century.
So to really understand why this specific biological event caused a total systemic meltdown, we can't start in 1347 when the ships actually arrived. We have to rewind.
You really do.
We have to look at the world right before the infection hit. We need to dissect Europe's fragile baseline, I guess you could call it.
So let's examine the architecture of 13th and early 14th century Europe. Because it wasn't a single unified empire with, centralized top-down control.
Like Rome or something.
Exactly, not like Rome. It was a highly fragmented, highly decentralized feudal network. Power was heavily layered.
Okay.
The king theoretically held dominion, right? But the actual operational control belonged to local nobles, barons, and lords. And they controlled the land and the agricultural labor force that was physically tied to it.
It's one of those things that sounds incredibly stable on paper. You have these three rigid estates, right? The clergy, those who pray. The nobility, those who fight. And the peasantry, those who work.
That's the structure.
And that's your lane, You're born into it, and you just don't get to change it. But reading through the notes here, this system seems unbelievably brittle in practice.
Oh, it was incredibly brittle.
It's like an older smartphone that's running a dozen really heavy apps in the background.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. Like if you just look at the home screen, it seems totally fine. But the battery is draining at 1% a minute, the processor is burning up, and it is literally one tap away from a total system freeze.
Yes. The system was deeply coherent, meaning everyone understood the rules. But it was so inflexible. It completely lacked the elasticity required to absorb any sort of systemic shock.
So what were these apps running in the background? What were these unseen cracks?
Well, underneath that illusion of stability, there were massive, quiet pressures building up. And it really begins with sheer demographic and economic strain.
Overpopulation, basically.
Exactly. In the 1200s, Europe experienced a massive population surge. The climate was unusually warm, a period historians actually call the medieval warm period, which led to agricultural abundance.
Better weather means more food.
More food means more people, so the population just exploded.
But the technology didn't explode with it, right? I mean, they're still relying on a purely agricultural core economy driven by human muscle and animal muscle.
Right, there are no tractors here.
Exactly. So suddenly, to feed this booming population, these peasants are forced to go clear forests and plow less fertile marginal soil.
And when you farm marginal soil just to survive, you very quickly run into the limits of medieval chemistry.
Because they can't just run to the store for fertilizer.
Exactly. They didn't have synthetic fertilizers. They relied on manure and a 3-field crop rotation system just to restore nitrogen to the soil.
Okay, explain the 3-field system really quickly.
Sure. Basically, you plant 2 fields and leave the third one empty or fallow so it can recover its nutrients for the next year. But with so many mouths to feed, they literally couldn't afford to leave fields fallow. They had to plant everything, so they overfarmed. They stripped the soil of nutrients way faster than nature could replenish them. So agricultural productivity actually began to drop precisely when the population reached its peak.
Man. So they are mathematically living on borrowed time.
Completely.
And then, as if that isn't bad enough, the sky literally turns against them. The notes go into the meteorological mechanics of the Little Ice Age.
Yes, around the early 1300s, atmospheric circulation patterns shifted. We see changes in the North Atlantic Oscillation.
And that was triggered by volcanoes, right?
That's the leading theory, yeah.
Yeah.
A series of massive volcanic eruptions globally spewed ash into the stratosphere.
Which reflects the sun.
Exactly. It reflects solar radiation away from the Earth. The result was a sudden, brutal drop in average temperatures across the entire northern hemisphere. The predictable, warm summers that gave them that population, boom, they vanished.
And it wasn't just cold, right? The notes say it was unbelievably wet.
Oh, incredibly wet.
Like, the data describes the years 1314 and 1315 as having torrential, almost biblical rains that simply didn't stop.
Yes.
But, I mean, how does a 2-degree temperature drop and some endless rain actually dismantle an entire agrarian society?
And mechanistically, it destroys the seed-to-yield ratio. See, wheat and barley, they require a very specific window of dry warmth to mature and be harvested.
Right.
The endless rains just saturated the soil. The seed grain literally rotted in the mud before it could even sprout.
Oh, wow.
And what little did manage to grow couldn't be dried out for storage, which meant it succumbed to ergot fungi and mold.
So even the food you get is toxic.
Exactly. Plus, salt evaporation pans on the coasts flooded out, meaning they didn't even have the salt required to preserve meat. The entire preservation and storage mechanism of the food supply chain just collapsed.
Which triggers the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317.
Yeah.
And this wasn't just a singular bad harvest. This was crops failing repeatedly over consecutive years, right?
Yeah. Over and over. Prices for grains surged by over 300% in some regions.
300%.
Yeah. Starvation became so rampant that local governments completely ceased to function. People were eating their seed grain.
Which guarantees starvation the next year.
Exactly. Or they were slaughtering their draft animals, which means they can't plow the fields even if the rain does finally stop.
It's a complete doom loop.
It is, and the biological consequence of this is generational, because the population didn't just bounce back when the weather finally stabilized.
Right, because you have kids growing up in this.
Exactly. Children who survived the Great Famine grew up with severe nutritional deficits. We know this from their skeletal remains. They show hypoplasia.
What is that?
It's these visible lines in the teeth that indicate periods where physical growth completely stopped due to starvation.
So their bodies just hit pause.
Yes. So as we approach the 1340s, millions of people walking around Europe are living with chronically compromised immune systems. Their baseline health was deeply fatigued.
Wow. Okay, so we have a malnourished, immunologically suppressed population working depleted soil. But wait. It's not just the food supply that's strained. The political and military infrastructure is bleeding out too.
Oh, absolutely.
The notes mention the early phases of the 100 Years' War between England and France.
Right. War in the 14th century was an entirely different mechanism of destruction than we picture today. The strategy wasn't just two armies meeting in an empty field to duke it out.
What were they doing instead?
The English employed a tactic called the chevauchée. The entire goal was to ride through the French countryside, deliberately burning crops, slaughtering livestock, and destroying mills and ovens.
So they were weaponizing the famine.
Exactly. It was economic terrorism. The point was to destroy the opposing king's tax base and undermine his legitimacy with his own people.
So you have decentralized governments fighting incredibly expensive wars by systematically destroying the exact agricultural infrastructure that their starting populations desperately need.
It's wild, isn't it?
That is absolute madness. But here's this piece of the puzzle that really fascinates me. If they were starving, freezing, and having their farms burned down by foreign armies, why didn't the whole social order just completely disintegrate right then and there?
That's the real question.
Yeah. What was the psychological glue keeping a peasant from just walking away from his lord's manor?
The psychological glue was ontological security. And in this era, that was provided almost exclusively by the Catholic Church.
The church.
Yes. The church wasn't just a place you went on Sunday. It was the fundamental framework of reality itself.
How so?
Well, it provided the structure of time with its liturgical calendar. It explained the existence of suffering as a temporary divine test. And most importantly, it defined the ultimate purpose of human existence, which was salvation.
Right.
People endured the unbearable because they genuinely believed the social hierarchy was divinely ordained by God. I mean, small rebellions happened, sure, but rejecting the system entirely meant risking eternal damnation.
But the sources point out that after the Great Famine, and with all these endless wars, subtle hairline fractures in that psychological armor started to appear.
They did.
Outwardly, the piety is still there, obviously. But quietly, people are starting to process this profound cognitive dissonance.
Yes, exactly.
Like, why would a benevolent God allow years of endless rain? Why are the bishops sitting in heavily fortified, incredibly wealthy palaces while the peasantry is literally out there eating tree bark?
Because trust is a depleting resource, you know? The church's absolute moral authority was straining. They had managed to contain the psychological fallout of the famine, but the framework was fragile.
It was holding by a thread.
Yes. If an event occurred that was so massive, so incomprehensible, that the religious framework couldn't explain it or stop it,
Yeah.
that entire interpretive system was at risk of shattering entirely.
Okay, so let's summarize the true baseline of Europe in 1347.
Let's do it.
We don't have a robust, healthy civilization. We have millions of immunologically compromised people. We have a rigid, mathematically doomed agricultural system. We have governments bankrupting themselves to burn down each other's food supplies.
Yeah.
And we have the very quiet, localized beginnings of doubt in the ultimate moral authority of the universe.
That's the stage.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because this is the exact moment that Europe's greatest asset, its connectivity, becomes the biological delivery system for its own collapse.
It really is the ultimate historical irony. To understand the collapse, we have to look at the delivery system. The pathogen, Yersinia pestis, did not travel in a vacuum.
Right, it didn't just blow in on the wind.
No, it traveled on the back of the commercial revolution.
Let's break down the actual biology first, because the mechanism here is just wild. The vector is famously a chain, right? Bacteria to flea, flea to rat, rat to human.
That's the classic chain.
But how does that actually work on a microscopic level? Because the notes get really granular here.
Yeah, so Yersinia pestis is an incredibly sophisticated bacterium. When a flea feeds on an infected rat, it ingests the bacteria.
Okay.
Inside the flea's gut, specifically a valve called the proventriculus, the bacteria multiply rapidly, and they create this thick, sticky mass, a biofilm.
Ew.
Yeah. And this biofilm completely blocks the flea's digestive tract.
Wait, so the flea is physically starving to death?
Yes.
No matter how much blood it drinks, because the blood can't even reach its stomach.
Exactly. So what happens, the starving flea goes into a biting frenzy. It's desperate. It bites a rat or a human, sucks up blood, but because the gut is blocked, the blood just mixes with that bacterial mass.
Oh my God.
And then the flea immediately regurgitates the highly infectious mixture directly back into the host's bloodstream.
That is horrifying.
It is. The flea's biological desperation is literally the engine of transmission.
And these ravenous fleas are riding on black rats, which are riding on merchant ships. And this brings us back to that irony of connectivity I mentioned. because Europe was undergoing a massive commercial expansion at this time, right?
Right. You had the Silk Road connecting east to west overland, and you had these massive maritime networks crisscrossing the Mediterranean and the Black Sea.
So what's fascinating here is how the very infrastructure that made Europe prosperous, innovations like, double-entry bookkeeping, letters of credit, and larger galley ships.
Things that built the modern economy.
Exactly. Those things became these super highways for disease.
Because when Genoese merchant ships pulled into port cities like Messina in Sicily or Venice or Marseille in late 1347, they weren't just offloading silk and spices and grain.
No.
They were offloading a biological bomb into the most densely packed environments on the continent.
The urban centers.
Yes.
Cities like Florence, Paris, and London were these incredibly vibrant hubs of trade, but they were absolute architectural nightmares for public health.
Total petri dishes.
You have thousands of people living in these wattle and daub houses, crowded so tightly together, with open sewers just running down the center of the street.
Right. The sanitation was virtually non-existent.
It is the absolute perfect breeding ground.
And once the disease jumped into the human population in those cities, the physical reality of the infection was just horrific.
Yeah, the sources detail 3 distinct manifestations of the plague, right? Each with its own deadly mechanic.
Yes. The most common was the bubonic plague.
Right, this is the one with the buboes.
Yeah.
But what is a bubo exactly? Why does the body do that?
Well, when the infected flea bites you, the bacteria enter the skin and they immediately hijack your macrophages.
Which are the immune cells.
Exactly. The very immune cells designed to eat them and destroy them. The bacteria hitch a ride inside these cells to the nearest lymph node, so usually in the groin, the armpit, or the neck.
Okay.
And once they're there, they multiply exponentially. This causes the lymph node to swell massively, becoming a painful hemorrhagic mass. That's the bubo. The lymphatic system is just completely overwhelmed.
Man. And then there's the septicemic plague, which sounds even faster.
Septicemic plague is terrifying. It occurs when the bacteria bypass the lymph nodes entirely and multiply directly in the bloodstream.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and this triggers a massive immune overreaction called endotoxin shock. It causes intravascular coagulation.
Which means what in plain English?
It means tiny blood clots form all over the body, cutting off circulation to your extremities. Fingers, toes, and noses turn black and necrotize. They die. Which, by the way, is one of the reasons it later became known as the Black Death.
I always wondered where that name came from.
Yeah. And with septicemic plague, death can occur within 24 hours, sometimes before any buboes even have a chance to form.
That's incredibly fast. But the most terrifying one, mechanically, at least according to the notes, is the pneumonic plague.
Yes.
Because this is the one that takes the rat and the flea completely out of the equation.
Once the bacteria reach the lungs of an infected person, they cause severe hemorrhagic pneumonia. The patient basically begins coughing up aerosolized blood and sputum that is just heavily laden with Yersinia pestis.
So in those crowded, poorly ventilated houses of medieval cities,
a single cough could infect an entire room. It spreads directly from human to human through the air. You don't need a flea bite anymore.
and the mortality rate.
The mortality rate for untreated pneumonic plague is virtually 100%, and it moves with terrifying speed.
The notes say you could wake up feeling perfectly fine, develop a sudden fever and a cough by noon, and literally be dead by the following morning.
Yes.
And this distinction in speed is a crucial analytical point in the research. Because we spent all this time talking about the gradual pressures, the overpopulation, the soil depletion, the little ice age.
Right.
Those were a slow burn. The system was bending over decades. But the plague was a fundamentally different kind of stress test.
This is the difference between chronic decay and an acute shock event. You see, the gradual pressures allowed for minute, painful adaptations.
Like farming worse land.
Right. You eat less, you farm different land, you suffer, but the system ultimately holds. The arrival of the plague allowed absolutely no time for adaptation. Cities were losing half their population in a matter of weeks. The sheer velocity of the demographic collapse meant the shock tested every single structural vulnerability simultaneously.
It's not just having a house with a leaky roof and some termites in the floorboards. You can live in that house, even if it's really uncomfortable.
Sure.
But then the Category 5 hurricane makes landfall. The hurricane is the sudden shock that exploits the termite damage and the leaky roof all at once, and the entire structure simply caves in.
And this brings us to the operational reality of the collapse. The structure simply cannot hold.
Which leads me to the most practical question of this entire deep dive. Because if the disease is moving that fast and killing people with that level of speed and sheer volume, how does the actual machinery of society keep running?
It doesn't.
Like, who is baking the bread? Who is running the courts? Who is burying the dead?
The short answer is no one. And this is where we transition from looking at a biological tragedy to dissecting a cascading failure of infrastructure. The death of individuals rapidly aggregates into the death of systems.
Okay, let's trace this exact cascade, because the mechanism is laid out beautifully in the data here. It starts with mass mortality, obviously.
Yes.
Which immediately triggers a labor collapse, which warps the food and economic systems, which breaks the back of governance, and ultimately results in a massive loss of public trust.
Let's look at the first domino, labor collapse and food disruption. Because at first glance, looking back from our modern perspective, you might logically assume that a massive population drop would actually solve the starvation problem.
Right. That's the obvious mathematical conclusion, isn't it? If half the people die, the surviving half suddenly have double the wheat, double the land, and double the resources.
It makes sense on paper.
So why did the food crisis actually get worse in the immediate aftermath?
Because that assumption completely misunderstands the medieval energy crisis.
How so?
You are measuring the wrong resource. You are looking at land as the bottleneck, but the actual bottleneck was energy, and energy in the 14th century wasn't coal, steam, or electricity.
It's biomass.
Exactly. It was entirely human and animal muscle power.
Let's break down the math on that for a second. If you want to harvest an acre of wheat, you don't just turn a key on a combine harvester and sit in an air-conditioned cab.
Right.
A human being has to physically walk through that field with a scythe, swinging it for 10 hours a day, burning thousands of calories.
And that's just the harvest.
Yeah. Then other humans have to manually bundle the sheaves, load them onto a wooden cart, and have an ox pull it miles down a muddy dirt road to a watermill.
Precisely. The agricultural system wasn't automated, it was intensely manual. So when the population collapses, the food system doesn't fail because the soil stops producing.
It fails because the energy required to extract the food from the soil vanishes.
Yes. The farmers die in staggering numbers, the fields go completely unharvested, the crops literally rot on the stalk.
Wow.
And the livestock, which is the secondary energy source, they wander off into the forests or they just die in their pens because there is no one left to tend them.
It's what the notes call a scarcity inversion. It's such a brilliant concept.
It really is.
The crisis shifted from a scarcity of production, which is what they suffered during the Great Famine when nothing would grow, to a scarcity of labor and distribution.
Exactly.
Like you could have a barn full of grain just 10 miles outside the city, but if all the carters are dead, the horses are gone, and the millers have fled, that grain might as well be on the moon.
Right. So you have localized, horrific starvation happening right alongside rotting, unharvested abundance.
That is incredibly bleak.
And this labor vacuum immediately warps the entire economic foundation. Because in a feudal system, land is the ultimate source of wealth and power.
Right. The nobility derives their whole status from the vast acreage they control and the serfs tied to it.
But suddenly, land is utterly worthless without the muscle to work it. The power dynamic violently flips. Labor, for the first time in centuries, becomes the most valuable and scarce commodity in Europe.
And the people in charge completely panic, don't they?
Oh, absolutely.
This is where the governance strain kicks in. They see the foundations of their wealth just evaporating, and they try to legislate reality away.
Yes.
The most famous example is England's Statute of Laborers in 1351.
Right. The king and the nobility saw surviving peasants suddenly demanding higher wages, sometimes double or triple the pre-plague rates, because the peasants knew their labor was rare.
Basic supply and demand.
Exactly. So the government's response was to essentially say, no, absolutely not. We are legally capping all wages at the exact levels they were before the plague hit.
Just ignoring the new reality entirely.
And furthermore, they said it was illegal for a peasant to leave their lord's land to seek better pay elsewhere.
It's like a central bank trying to fight hyperinflation by simply making it illegal for a grocery store to change its price tags.
Perfect analogy.
While completely ignoring the fact that the entire global supply chain has been annihilated. You can't fix a supply-side collapse by just freezing prices. But more importantly, how did they even expect to enforce this?
Well, that is the fatal flaw, and it highlights the actual death of the bureaucracy. Law is not magic, right?
Right.
It requires a physical mechanism of enforcement. It requires sheriffs, bailiffs, reeves, and judges to travel the countryside, hear cases, and impose fines.
But those local officials were dying at the exact same rates, if not higher, due to their constant contact with the public.
Yes, you can write the harshest labor law imaginable on a piece of parchment in London, but if there's no bailiff left alive in the village to enforce it, it's just a piece of parchment.
The physical machinery of the state simply evaporated.
The economy didn't just stall. It forcefully, violently distorted. The operational failure of governance was profound.
But underneath the unharvested fields and the useless laws, there was a much more dangerous, invisible crisis brewing, wasn't there? A complete crisis of legitimacy.
Yes.
Because while the physical breakdown is terrifying, the data highlights a deeper psychological failure. We have to look at what happens inside the mind of the average person when they look around and realize that the institutions they were told were divinely appointed. The king, the local lord, the church are absolutely powerless.
They couldn't do a thing.
What happens when you realize no one is coming to save you?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where the shared belief that the system works totally dissolves. This is the lived experience of the collapse, and it is largely defined by a massive, suffocating information void.
We have to forget the way we consume news today. I mean, there are no push notifications. Information moved at the speed of a horse or a merchant walking down a dirt road.
Right, which means the communication of the disaster completely lagged behind the incubation period of the disease itself.
This asynchronous flow of information created an eerie, terrifying overlap, didn't it? The notes describe it so vividly.
They do. You had people living in this liminal space where the machinery of daily life was still churning. Markets were opening in one town, church bells were ringing for Sunday Mass, families were maintaining their routines.
But just 3 miles down the road, the neighboring village was completely silent, just filled with the dead.
The illusion of normalcy persisted just long enough to fatally mislead people.
Because you'd hear a terrifying rumor from a passing friar that some coastal town was wiped out. But you'd look at your window, and your neighbor is planting turnips, the sun is shining, and the baker is pulling bread out of the oven.
Normalcy bias kicks in.
Exactly. The human brain naturally defaults to normalcy bias. You think, well, it's just a wild rumor, or maybe it happened over there, but it won't happen here.
But the awareness of the collapse always arrived slightly too late to do anything about it.
And when the reality finally shattered that illusion, the psychological dread must have been unbearable.
Unimaginable.
Because when people demanded explanations, the institutions they trusted had absolutely nothing of value to offer. Medical science at the time was largely based on the ancient Greek theories of Galen and Hippocrates.
Right. They had no concept of germ theory, no microscopes, no idea what a bacterium or a virus was.
So how did the doctors of the 14th century actually explain what was happening?
Well, they relied heavily on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They believed health was a perfect balance of these fluids.
Right.
When confronted with the plague, the dominant medical explanation became miasma, or corrupted air.
Bad air.
Yes. They believed that astrological alignments, specifically, they looked at the conjunction of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn in 1345, had somehow drawn noxious vapors up from the rotting earth.
So they thought this corrupted air was literally seeping into the pores of the skin and disrupting the humoral balance.
That was the leading scientific theory.
Which is why you see doctors advising people to burn aromatic woods, or carry pouches of sweet-smelling herbs. Or even, bizarrely, the notes mention people sitting in sewers.
Oh, yeah. They thought the bad smell of the sewage would somehow overpower the miasma of the plague.
That is just. It's a desperate, frantic attempt to impose logic on a completely alien biological threat.
And when the herbal poultices and the bloodletting completely failed, the medical explanations gave way to the theological one.
Which was what?
The most pervasive narrative became that this was an act of divine retribution. God was pouring out his wrath on a deeply sinful world, much like the biblical flood.
But when you believe the apocalypse is a punishment for sin, you instinctively start looking for the sinners.
Yes.
When there is no microscopic enemy to fight, human psychology demands a visible enemy. And this led to one of the absolute darkest chapters of the systemic collapse. The scapegoating.
When scientific and institutional frameworks fail, fear rushes in to fill the void. Conspiracy thinking just exploded across Europe.
People convinced themselves that the plague wasn't a natural occurrence or even a generalized divine punishment, but a deliberate act of sabotage, right?
Exactly. They claimed that minority groups were poisoning the town wells.
And the notes detail the horrific, unjust violence directed primarily at Jewish communities.
It was devastating. Despite the fact that Jewish people were dying of the plague at the exact same rates as Christians, The desperate need for a tangible enemy overrode all logic.
Entire communities in the Rhineland and Switzerland were massacred.
Yes. And local authorities either looked the other way or actively participated. It was a desperate, dark attempt to find a cause they could actually see, capture, and destroy in order to regain some false sense of control over their reality.
It represents the ultimate fragmentation of the social bond. When trust evaporates, empathy often evaporates right along with it.
Survival instincts override the social contract. You see accounts from writers like Giovanni Boccaccio in the Decameron describing how brother abandoned brother, how wives abandoned husbands.
And, most shockingly to the medieval mind, how parents abandoned their own sick children, fleeing the house the moment the first bubo appeared.
Just leaving them behind.
It's incredibly bleak. It's easy to look at that and say, well, human nature is inherently selfish and the collapse just proved it. But wait, I have to push back on that a bit, because the sources show a massive contradiction here. It wasn't uniformly evil, was it?
Not at all. And that duality is crucial to understanding how systems actually break down.
How so?
In the exact same town where one family is barricading their doors and abandoning their children, you would witness startling moments of extreme, almost incomprehensible altruism.
Like the priests. You had local parish priests who fully believed that dying without last rites meant eternal damnation for the soul.
Yes.
And knowing with absolute certainty that entering an infected house was a death sentence, they walked in anyway to hear confessions.
The mortality rate among the clergy in some areas was astronomical because they simply refused to abandon their post.
And you had neighbors organizing mutual aid, bringing food to the sick and leaving it on the doorstep.
You also saw the emergence of radical fringe movements attempting to seize control of the spiritual narrative.
Like the flagellants.
Yes, the flagellants are the most famous example. These were large groups of lay people, not ordained clergy, who walked barefoot from town to town.
Chanting hymns and publicly whipping themselves.
Right, with leather scourges embedded with iron spikes.
It's a visceral, bloody display of desperation. The logic being, if we inflict the punishment on ourselves voluntarily, if we bleed enough to show true repentance, maybe God will see our suffering and lift the plague.
It's an attempt to negotiate with the apocalypse.
Yeah.
It is the manifestation of profound psychological disorientation. The old rules, the old hierarchies, the old medical facts, they simply no longer applied.
But this exact psychological breaking point, the moment where the structure completely shakes apart and the old realities die, is actually the precise moment where the seeds of a new world are planted. So what does this all mean? We've walked through the fragile baseline, the sudden biological shock, the cascade of infrastructural failure, and the sheer psychological terror of the void.
Yes.
But the story doesn't end in 1351 with Europe turning into a permanent empty wasteland. The system didn't disappear into dust. It hit the absolute bottom, and then it transformed.
It had to.
Let's look at the aftermath and the structural reconfiguration.
The most immediate and tangible shift, as we briefly touched on with the governance failure, was the permanent redistribution of economic power from land to labor.
That's scarcity inversion again.
Exactly. It fundamentally altered the microeconomics of the peasant class. The old feudal order was based entirely on obligation. You work my land because you are a serf, you are legally tied to this dirt, and it is the divinely ordained law.
But post-plague, that shifts entirely to a negotiation-based order.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine the psychological shift of a surviving peasant. For generations, his family has been treated like property. Now, he looks at the local lord, who is staring at hundreds of acres of rotting grain because he has no one to harvest it.
And the peasant realizes.
He realizes, you need me way more than I need you. The conversation changes to, I will work your land if you pay me triple the wage, give me better food, and lower my rent. And if you don't, I will simply walk 5 miles down the road to the next manor, because that lord is just as desperate and he will pay.
Exactly. This newfound leverage gave the lower classes an economic and physical mobility they had never experienced in the history of the feudal system.
It fueled the slow, irreversible death of serfdom in Western Europe.
Now, it wasn't a peaceful, smooth transition, obviously. The nobility fought back fiercely with laws and taxes,
Which eventually erupted into massive conflicts like the English Peasants' Revolt in 1381.
Right. But the genie was out of the bottle. The fundamental economic dynamic had shifted from coercion to market demand.
The survivors suddenly had a voice, and they had purchasing power. But the transformation wasn't just economic, was it?
No, not at all.
There was a massive cultural and psychological shift. The data you provided dives into the art and culture of the period, which I find endlessly fascinating. The psychological baseline of society darkened, but it also became hyper-realistic. Art became absolutely obsessed with mortality.
You see the explosion of the memento mori theme, which is Latin for remember that you will die.
The dance macabre.
Yes, the dance of death. It was a hugely popular artistic motif, showing grinning skeletons leading kings, popes, merchants, and peasants alike to the grave.
Hand in hand.
Right. It was a stark visual reminder that death was the ultimate equalizer. No amount of wealth or divine right could protect you from the plague.
You even see it in the tombs of the incredibly wealthy. Before the plague, a noble's tomb would feature a beautiful, idealized marble statue of them in their prime, looking peaceful and asleep.
Very dignified.
But after the plague, you see the rise of transient tombs, or cadaver monuments. It's a two-tiered tomb. On top is the idealized statue, but underneath it is a second sculpture showing the exact same person as a rotting, emaciated corpse being eaten by worms.
It is an incredibly aggressive, unavoidable confrontation with the fragility of life.
And this intense awareness of mortality, coupled with the systemic failures they had just witnessed, profoundly changed their relationship with the Catholic Church.
It really did. Now, the Church absolutely survived the Black Death. It remained the dominant institution in Europe. But its aura of absolute, unquestionable, exclusive authority was permanently dented.
Well, it makes complete logical sense. If the Church was the sole conduit to God, why couldn't they stop the greatest catastrophe in human history?
Right.
If the supposedly holy bishops and the sinful thieves died at the exact same horrific rate, well, maybe the institution isn't the sole gatekeeper of divine truth.
Precisely. The trauma birthed a new kind of a religious skepticism, or rather, a desire for religious independence.
Religion became more deeply personal.
We see the rise of lay mysticism, where individuals sought a direct emotional connection with God, bypassing the hierarchical structures of the priesthood that had failed to protect them.
Like the Lollards.
Yes, movements like the Lollards in England began to quietly question church dogma, translating scripture, and demanding a more authentic, less institutionalized faith.
And when you take all of these shifting pieces, the questioning of absolute authority, the new social mobility of the peasantry, the breakdown of rigid land-based feudalism, and the shift toward a dynamic, wage-based, market-driven economy.
The notes make a brilliant point here.
Yes.
These shifts laid the quiet structural foundations for the Renaissance.
It is often referred to as the unintended Renaissance. But it is critical to state that the Black Death did not cause the Renaissance.
Right.
A bacterial infection doesn't create humanism or the printing press. But it cleared away the rigid, immovable, centuries-old structures that would have actively prevented the Renaissance from taking root. I used an analogy earlier about a hurricane, but looking at this aftermath, it actually makes me think of a massive forest fire.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, like when a crown fire rips through an old-growth forest, it is utterly terrifying and purely destructive in the moment. It obliterates everything in its path. But those old, massive trees had dominated the ecosystem for centuries.
Taking all the light.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They created a canopy so incredibly thick that no sunlight could ever reach the forest floor. The soil was depleted. Nothing new, no diverse plant life could ever grow under that shadow.
Right.
But the fire violently burns away that rigid, monopolistic canopy. It leaves ashes, yes, which is tragic, but it also unlocks the nutrients in the soil, and crucially, it allows sunlight to finally hit the ground. And from those ashes, entirely new, much more flexible, diverse saplings can finally take root and build a different kind of ecosystem.
That is a highly accurate structural analogy. The collapse was a horrific ending, but it was also a brutal transition state that violently forced open the space required for a more fluid, modern world to emerge. It was a macro-structural reset.
And looking at the grand macro sweep of history like that, tracking the massive economic shifts, the death of serfdom, the timeline leading into the Renaissance, it is incredibly intellectually satisfying. It gives the chaos a neat narrative arc.
It does.
But what I absolutely love about the stack of research you sent us is that the author doesn't let us stay completely detached, hovering safely up in the historical stratosphere. The final section of this document brings everything we've talked about back down to the deeply personal, almost philosophical level.
Yes, the macro view is necessary for context, but the micro view is where the actual human experience of collapse resides. But before we dive into that final reflection, the notes do an excellent job of busting a few persistent modern myths about this event that I think are worth explicitly highlighting just as they frame this final discussion.
Right, let's clear the board real quick. Myth number one, the Black Death was just a really bad disease. We've established thoroughly that it was a systemic stress test that found a fragile, exhausted system and broke it.
Absolutely. Myth number two, the collapse was absolute and total.
Like Mad Max.
Exactly. It wasn't an absolute void where everyone reverted to cavemen. The collapse was highly uneven and partial. Many local institutions, courts, and markets kept limping along in a diminished capacity. People still tried to enforce contracts and write wills while the world ended around them.
Myth number three, everyone reacted with uniform panic and cruelty. We discussed the duality. Extreme cruelty and extreme, sacrificial compassion existed side by side, often in the very same street.
And finally, the myth we just contextualized, that the plague directly caused the Renaissance. It was a contributing force, a violent ground-clearing event, but not the singular cause.
Which brings us perfectly to the final and frankly the most fascinating section of the notes. This is an exploration framed through a subpersonality lens labeled PIRA.
The Tira persona.
It provides a profoundly human psychological framework for looking at all of this chaos.
This section shifts the methodology from historical analysis to deep psychological reflection. It asks the question, how does a single conscious individual actually process the cognitive dissonance of living inside a collapse?
Right.
It focuses entirely on the internal, agonizing tension between the human need for meaning, the religious or philosophical faith that insists there is an underlying order to the universe, and the terrifying empirical reality that presents only overwhelming, indiscriminate randomness.
This section completely caught me off guard in the best way possible, because when you are sitting in a house in 1348 and your neighbor, who is a terrible, selfish person, survives, but the kind, gentle priest who gives his food to the poor dies a horrific, agonizing death.
Yeah.
Your brain short-circuits.
It does.
The Tira perspective identifies a very specific psychological role during a systemic breakdown. It's the role of the observer, the witness, the quiet stabilizer.
It's a radical departure from how we usually conceptualize heroism in a crisis, isn't it?
Completely.
The cura persona is not the hero who magically invents a cure or fixes the broken system. And crucially, it is not the panicked citizen who flees or turns to violence. It is the person who commits to staying mentally and physically present while the structure is disintegrating around them.
There is a line in the notes describing this mindset that I highlighted heavily. If others are reacting, I am absorbing. If systems are breaking, I am trying to make sense of the fragments.
That is powerful.
That is such a quiet, powerful definition of true psychological resilience. It's not about bouncing back immediately. It's about not looking away.
And this raises the most important philosophical question of the entire deep dive, which is the central tension of the Tira notes. It echoes the later existential work of people like Viktor Frankl.
Yes, man's search for meaning.
Exactly. The question is, if suffering has meaning, what is this? And if this level of horrific random suffering doesn't have meaning, how do we possibly keep going?
Because when the structured explanations, the absolute certainty of the church, the authority of the king, the theories of the doctors, when all of those shatter simultaneously, the natural human instinct is to desperately scramble to find a new rigid answer.
We want a new framework.
Right. To invent a wild conspiracy about poison wells, or to find a scapegoat, or to whip yourself in the streets, just to feel some semblance of control over your reality again. But the Tira subpersonality realizes something profound. The most powerful adaptation to collapse isn't finding a new, rigid answer to replace the old one.
The adaptation is a profound internal shift in orientation. It is the difficult movement away from demanding to know, why is this happening? Because demanding an explanation from a universe that might not provide one only leads to madness or cruelty.
Exactly.
Instead, the resilient mind shifts toward asking, given that this is happening, how do we sit with this together?
It's moving from the desperate need for answers to the quiet offering of presence. It's about accepting the paradox of the human condition, recognizing that the systems around you can be fundamentally, permanently broken, and yet the moments you share with others inside that brokenness can still hold immense transcendent meaning.
The profound insight here is that true resilience is the capacity to be a steady point in an unsteady world. It is the hard-won wisdom to hold the terrifying reality of life's fragility without letting that terror empty you of your compassion.
Wow.
The historical lesson of the Black Death is that human systems will inevitably fail. The medical explanations will fall short, the governments will fracture, but how we choose to meet each other inside that failure, how much grace we extend when the rules no longer apply, that is the one variable we still entirely control.
Not as a solution to the collapse, but
Yeah.
as something human. Man, that specific phrasing in the notes just gave me chills. It reframes the entire catastrophe.
It is a remarkable synthesis. It takes a
Yeah.
massive macro-historical event defined by staggering statistics and distills it into a deeply personal, actionable ethic for navigating uncertainty.
It really
Yeah.
is. So let's step back and look at the massive journey we've just taken through these documents. We didn't just look at a disease. We started by dissecting a fragile, rigid, pre-plague feudal baseline, a system exhausted to its core by overpopulation, overfarming, catastrophic climate shifts, and endless war.
Right.
We saw how the very infrastructure of the commercial revolution, the ships and the trade routes, delivered a sudden, violent, microscopic biological shock that the system had no elasticity to absorb.
We trace the exact mechanistic cascade of that failure, from the biological reality of mass death to the scarcity inversion of the labor collapse. We saw how that warped the food supply and the economy, how it broke the operational capacity of governance, and how it led to the terrifying, complete death of public trust.
We looked deeply into the lived experience of the people trapped inside that failure. We explored the suffocating information voids, the desperate, violent scapegoating born of medical ignorance, but also the incredible, quiet acts of extreme compassion that existed right alongside the utter abandonment. And we saw how, from those ashes, economic power irreversibly shifted from land to labor, permanently denting absolute institutional authority and laying the volatile ground for a more fluid, dynamic, questioning world.
And finally, we were reminded beautifully through the Tyra lens that from the inside, a systemic collapse does not look like a neat, inevitable chapter in a history book. It looks like a terrifying series of uncertain, high-stakes, daily decisions made by people who have no idea how the story ends.
Exactly. Which brings me to a thought I want to leave you with as we wrap up today. I want you to think about the extraordinarily complex systems that you and I rely on completely every single day. Global, algorithmically driven, just-in-time supply chains, instantly connected digital communication networks, the delicate physical infrastructure of the power grid.
We live in systems that are engineered for maximum frictionless efficiency, but which are inherently lacking in deep, localized redundancy.
Right. The Black Death showed us, brutally, that a system's true fragility is completely invisible until the exact right stress test arrives. The cracks are always quiet until the shock hits. So I want you to ask yourself, what invisible cracks exist in our heavily optimized world today, just waiting for the right Category 5 hurricane to expose them? And more importantly, if the structure shakes, if the modern X-ray machine breaks and the answers aren't clean or binary anymore, how will you choose to show up for the people around you? When the information void opens up, will you scramble for a rigid explanation and a scapegoat, or will you choose to be that steady point in an unsteady world?
That is the ultimate question that the history of collapse asks of the present.
Thank you so much for sharing such an incredible, deeply researched, and thought-provoking stack of notes for today's deep dive. We absolutely loved exploring the mechanics of this with you. Until next time, keep questioning the baseline.